Breast milk is the best source of nutrition for the health and overall development of infants and young children. You've probably heard this phrase attached to most formula milk advertisements, right? And it always has to be read as quickly as possible. At least now we have some warnings that natural nutrition is the best option. Although the content of the advertisements that follow seems to suggest quite the opposite. Historically, there was a force that did everything it could to make the world believe that powdered cow's milk mixed with sugar was far superior to breast milk, even though this meant intentionally depriving babies of proper nutrition. I think that's one of the most unethical acts humanity has ever committed. But for some people, it doesn't matter as long as it helps them build the world's largest food empire. This was one of the most notorious healthcare scandals of the 20th century, and honestly, I don't know if I'll face repercussions for this video. But this video is here to expose Nestlé. How do you convince people to believe one of the most misleading claims in history? Your weapon: advertising and relentless messaging. The average consumer, I mean everyday consumers, doesn't have the time or expertise to thoroughly understand every product they buy. They will simply follow others. Those who want to look trendy will follow what celebrities use, while those who care about health will look at what doctors recommend. And Nestlé realized this simple truth. If you want to convince people that formula milk is better than breast milk, have doctors tell them that. Let's go back to Nestlé's communication campaign in the 1970s. It wasn't complicated. Doctors just needed to say that formula was better and breast milk wasn't sufficient. You didn't miss here. This is one of the most manipulative claims I've ever heard. And do you know what's even more concerning? They specifically targeted poorer, underdeveloped countries at the time, mainly in Asia and Africa. They even had employees dressed as nurses distribute free samples and offer medical advice. Remember, those samples had to be just large enough for mothers to rely on them until their natural milk supply dried up. Nestlé exploited the innocence and lack of knowledge of people in these impoverished nations. What's worse than telling starving families, "Use our product, it's great for your baby," even though they might not know they need to boil water before mixing the formula? And who cares if their water source is contaminated? The result was devastating. Reports began to emerge linking Nestlé to malnutrition and infant mortality in developing countries. Of course, Nestlé had an exit strategy.
Would you agree with me that your product should not be used where there is impure water? Yes or no? We gave all instructions. Just answer. That was supposed to be said.
Think about it. How many mothers in Africa in the 1970s could read English? On July 4th, 1977, a boycott against Nestlé was launched in the US, spreading across Europe by the early 1980s. This event became one of the defining moments in human history, highlighting the intersection between human rights, humanitarian action, corporate responsibility, and free market capitalism. Consumers in developed countries stood up for mothers in developing nations. However, Nestlé faced an even bigger issue. Whether the water was clean or not, the powdered milk formula they sold could never replace breast milk. It lacked the essential antibodies and didn't provide enough nutrition for babies to grow healthily. In 1981, the World Health Organization established regulations banning comparisons between breast milk and formula milk. But once again, Nestlé found a loophole by focusing on loosely regulated markets, such as Southeast Asia. In the US and Europe, Nestlé said, "Breast milk is number one." Meanwhile, in other markets, they continued bribing doctors, distributing free samples, and running hospital campaigns. And to this day, they still follow similar tactics. But the concerning practices didn't stop there. Humans can survive weeks without food, but only 2 to 4 days without one essential resource: water. So why not capitalize on water? Everyone knows tap water is incredibly cheap, but if you bottle that same water, slap on a label saying it's pure spring water from majestic mountains, profits skyrocket. Each barrel of Nestlé water is purchased for $10 and bottled to be sold for $50,000. Few people know that Nestlé is the largest bottled water producer in the world. This isn't speculation. Nestlé has faced multiple lawsuits over water rights. But just like the formula scandal, Nestlé pays fines in Europe and the US, while in developing countries. Well, you know what happens. Let's look at Pakistan. In 2013, it was discovered that Nestlé had deprived millions of people of clean water, bottled it, and sold it back to the same impoverished communities. After formula milk and bottled water, we come to Kit Kat. Have you tried it? These chocolates are primarily made from cocoa, which is grown mainly in regions such as West Africa, Asia, and Latin America. Ghana and Ivory Coast, two West African nations, supply over 70% of the world's cocoa. Most cocoa harvested in these countries is sold to major chocolate manufacturers, including, you guessed it, Nestle. The issue is cocoa isn't cheap, but corporate greed demands it be as cheap as possible. This leads farm owners to rely on child labor to keep costs competitive. Many children in West Africa come from impoverished families. With the promise of high wages from traffickers, many children are lured, or even kidnapped, from villages in countries like Burkina Faso and Somalia. Once these children are taken to remote cocoa farms, the chance of seeing their families again is slim. Estimates suggest over 2 million child laborers work on cocoa farms, most aged between 12 and 16. Some investigations have even found children as young as 5 working with machetes, climbing trees to harvest cocoa pods, and carrying sacks weighing over 45 kilograms. Each year, the chocolate industry generates approximately $100 billion in revenue. Yet in 18 years, they've only invested $148 million to address the child labor crisis. So be mindful, your Kit Kat bar might just be made from cocoa harvested under heartbreaking conditions. And finally, Ethiopia, one of the poorest countries in the world. In 2002, Ethiopia suffered one of the worst famines in human history. But how is this connected to Nestle? In 1986, Nestle acquired the parent company of a German firm. The issue? In the 1970s, this company was nationalized by the Ethiopian government. This meant Ethiopia owed Nestle money, right? The Ethiopian government offered to settle the debt for $1.5 million, based on the exchange rate at the time of nationalization. But Nestle insisted on using the 2002 exchange rate, inflating the debt to $6 million. When exposed, advocacy groups pointed out that $6 million was insignificant to Nestle, but could provide clean water for 1.5 million families or treat diarrhea for 750,000 children. That same year, Nestle made $3.9 billion in profit. Instead of considering ethical responsibility, Nestle insisted on collecting the debt. Eventually, they backed down, but their reputation was already deeply tarnished. Ironically, despite being one of the most criticized corporations in the world, Nestle remains the largest food empire globally. After all, everyone needs milk, water, and chocolate, and Nestle is remarkably good at burying its dark past. Today, you might not notice the Nestle name, but chances are your home is filled with products they own. With over 2,000 brands under their belt, escaping them is nearly impossible. But after watching this video, you'll understand. Behind every vast fortune, there may well be a story of hidden consequences.